This video was made possible by Skillshare. Learn from 21,000 classes for free for 2 months at skl.sh/wendover3. There are plenty of lines you can draw on the globe, but perhaps none is more consequential than the equator. Of the 15 wealthiest countries in the world as measured by GDP per capita, all are in the northern hemisphere. Only 800 million of Earth's 7.6 billion residents live south of the equator. There is a clear divide between north and south, but of those 800 million people, a quarter of them, about 207 million, live here in Brazil. The country is an exception to the global trend. Brazil is the 5th most populous country in the world and the most populous entirely within the southern hemisphere. Its economy has grown enormously and the country is quickly developing, although the very land it sits on stacks the odds against it. Its location gives it a disadvantage. Given this, the question is whether Brazil can develop into a world superpower by the likes of the US, Europe, Russia, India, and China, or if the country is doomed to fail. Brazil, of course, looks like this, but in reality, almost 80% of the country's population lives here, within 200 miles of the coast. You do see a concentration of population near the coast in any country as it provides a cheap and easy means of transportation by boats and a source of food through fishing, but few countries have such a severe concentration of people by the oceans as Brazil. This small area, for example, is home to 3 of Brazil's 6 largest cities. Normally, this would help development as the area in between cities will urbanize, but this map doesn't tell the whole story. This one does. You see, this area of Brazil is rather mountainous. The major cities mostly exist in small pockets of low-altitude, flat land on the ocean. This is because major cities need easy water access to get goods in and out. The majority of Brazil's coast is defined by steep, sheer cliffs. Petrópolis, for example, a suburb of Rio, is a mere 13 miles from the ocean, and yet it sits at almost 3,000 feet of altitude. The rare areas with low-altitude land on the water are where cities like Porto Alegre, Rio de Janeiro, and Recife are, but this pattern has 2 consequences. First, these cities, while being on flat land themselves, are surrounded by cliffs and mountainous regions, which means their growth is limited. There are plenty of cities that exist in mountainous regions, but the world's largest and most influential cities like London and Delhi and Beijing all exist in areas with absolutely no geographical features limiting their growth. The fact that Brazil's cities locate in rare low-altitude coastal land means that the country will likely never have a megalopolis by the likes of the Pearl River Delta or the US Northeast. It takes a surprising 6 hours to drive between Rio and Sao Paulo, and since there's no low-altitude coastal land in between them, there are really no major cities in between them too. Brazil's cities are confined to the geographically convenient areas which are spread out from each other. This means the cities can't collaborate easily with each other, thereby limiting Brazil's impact on the world stage. Like any large country, Brazil's development potential is also linked to how it gets its food. This in fact might be Brazil's greatest obstacle, as it really doesn't have much great farmland, at least yet. The country's main agricultural region is its south, which is blessed with great soil and great rivers that help transport crops away from their farms. Interestingly, the same elevation that leads to steep coastal cliffs causes rivers to run in a counterintuitive direction. The Tietê River, for example, starts near Sao Paulo a mere 10 miles away from the Atlantic Ocean, but then runs inland almost 500 miles where it flows into the Paraná River, which eventually flows out into the ocean near Buenos Aires, Argentina. If a farmer wants to export their food abroad, it's often cheaper to first ship it thousands of miles by boat on these rivers than just hundreds of miles overland to Brazil's coast due to their poor road infrastructure. This means that Argentina gets the business of packing up and shipping Brazil's food to other countries. That's just lost money for Brazil as a result of their geography. Brazil's south, though, does not even have enough food to feed the country's own 200 million residents. Given that, the question is where to put the rest of the farms. In Brazil's north is the Amazon basin. The central feature of this region is, of course, the Amazon River, which is navigable for boats. Normally, this feature would lead to a significant population as navigable rivers serve as cheap and easy transport for crops and goods, but the banks of the Amazon are a tough place to farm or live. Not only are they muddy and unstable, which makes building difficult, but the Amazon also regularly floods, which means that every year, many of the communities on the banks of the Amazon can have their streets underwater for months. Building and living in the Amazonian cities is difficult, but what's more difficult is building the roads in and out. The largest city in the Amazon, Manaus, is home to 2.6 million people. It's as big as Baltimore, and yet there are only 3 roads connecting the city to the outside world. Many of the smaller towns around the Amazon have no roads going in and out, as it's just incredibly costly and difficult to build roads through the rainforest. In fact, rather unbelievably, there is not a single bridge spanning over the Amazon, so there is no way to drive from the northernmost region of Brazil to the rest without taking a ferry. Overall, this whole area is just empty. Even if there was the infrastructure to transport crops to the market, farming in the Amazon involves clearing huge amounts of land, and even then, the soil is relatively infertile, which leads to poor yields. Despite being Brazil's largest state, Amazonas is home to just 1.8% of the population. It just costs too much to build the infrastructure needed to live there. To the south of the Amazon, though, is an area known as the Cerrado. This vast savanna used to be in the same category as the Amazon. It was empty. The problem was not only that there was no natural network of rivers to get crops out of the area, but also that the soil was too acidic and lacking enough nutrients to easily grow large quantities of crops. Between both the Amazon and the Cerrado being off limits for large-scale farming, that meant that Brazil really didn't have much land at all for farming. 30 years ago, with only the south to farm, Brazil was actually a net importer of food. It bought more food from other countries than it sold. That was until researchers discovered that all you needed to do to fix the soil was add phosphorus and lime. The phosphorus served as a fertilizer in the place of natural nutrients, and the lime worked to reduce the level of acidity. In the early 2000s, the country spread more than 25 million tons of lime per year, and so today the Cerrado accounts for 70% of Brazil's farmland. In addition, Brazil has begun growing soybeans. This plant is normally grown in more temperate climates such as the US, northern China, or Japan, but through crossbreeding and genetic modification, it can be modified to grow in warmer and acidic environments such as the Brazilian Cerrado. Thanks to the enormous amount of land Brazil has and these technological advancements, the country has gone from producing 16% of the world's soybean in 2005 to 31% today. A country's level of development is often linked to how good its natural transportation system is. That's part of why the US developed so much so fast. It has a great system of navigable rivers right in its agricultural heartland that helps get goods from the fields to cities fast and inexpensively. The Brazilian Cerrado, though, does not have that. It doesn't even have much of a pre-existing network of roads, since before this recent agricultural advancement, barely anyone lived there. Therefore, anyone who wants to farm in the Cerrado has to find land, level it, treat it with phosphate and lime, and build roads to get supplies in and crops out. Cerrado farms can be profitable, but it takes an enormous amount of money to build the infrastructure needed to start a farm. It's not like the US or France or China, where all you need is some land. The consequence of this is that farms in Brazil tend to be owned by corporations rather than individuals, because only corporations have the money to build farms. That, therefore, increases the level of wealth disparity in Brazil. According to the World Bank's Gini Index, Brazil is the 11th most economically unequal country in the world. Lower wealth disparity and the emergence of a middle class are indicators of economic development, so the country should want to fix this. Brazil's government has recognized its infrastructure problem as a source of its wealth disparity and has therefore worked to build roads in the interior so that more individuals can run farms. But the government only has so much money to spend, and it's a big country. Brazil does, though, understand the importance of its core. It understands that the coastal cities are constrained and that economic development will come from the center. It was partially for that reason that the country decided to move its capital from Rio de Janeiro to here, Brasilia. The thinking was that putting the capital in the core would stimulate the economically underdeveloped region, and in many ways, it worked. The city simply did not exist before 1960, yet today more than 4 million people live in its metropolitan area. Being located on relatively flat land, unlike Rio, the city can just grow and grow and grow without hindrance. Brazil has potential, but its defining issue is that it's an expensive place. It's a vicious cycle. In order to make money, Brazil needs to invest in its infrastructure, but without people making money, it doesn't have the tax money to build what it takes to transition into the first world. The question of why tropical countries are less developed is an enormous one without a clear answer, but Brazil is one of the most likely candidates to break this trend. It certainly lags behind other developing countries like China, but as its agriculture industry develops, it will become a bigger and bigger exporter, which will bring more money in. With time, its average income will inch up. The country already does have major companies in other industries such as banking, manufacturing, and oil, but with how big Brazil is, agriculture is the one that's the world's focus right now. Only France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States export more agricultural products per year, which is good company to be in.